wife said I'm independent. I said, prove it, and made her wishes come true. I never thought that those simple words would ignite a firestorm that changed my life, my marriage, and everything I believed about love, responsibility, and freedom. What started as a bold declaration from my wife quickly turned into a challenge that forced both of us to confront who we really were, and whether independence and commitment could coexist under the same roof. I'm here to tell you exactly how it all unfolded, from the moment she made her claim to the way I decided to test it and the unexpected transformation that followed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Adrian, and I had been married to Claire for nearly 8 years when this story began. To outsiders, we seemed like a typical couple who had managed to build a stable and comfortable life. I worked as a project manager in a mid-sized construction firm, while she pursued a career in digital design, mostly working from home. We owned a modest but cozy 2-story house in a quiet neighborhood, with a small backyard where we often spent weekends grilling food or just talking under the string lights we had hung along the fence. On the surface, it all looked good. We weren't wealthy, but we weren't struggling either. We had our routines, our quirks, our little arguments, but nothing that screamed trouble. At least, not until that one evening when Claire uttered the words that cracked everything wide open. It was a Friday night. I came home later than usual after a long day at work, and I found Claire sitting at the dining table, sipping wine while scrolling on her tablet. She looked calm but had a sharp edge in her eyes, like she was carrying a thought that she couldn't keep in much longer. I asked her how her day was, and she shrugged, then suddenly set down her glass with a little too much force. "You know, Adrian," she said, "I don't think you realize how independent I am. I don't actually need you the way you think I do." Her voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as if she had been turning those words over in her head for a while. At first, I laughed it off. I thought it was just one of those comments people make when they're tired or want to prove a point in the middle of some unspoken disagreement. But she didn't laugh. She leaned in and repeated herself, slower this time. "I mean it. I'm independent. I can take care of myself, and I don't want to feel like I'm dependent on anyone, even you." That's when I realized she wasn't just venting. She was making a statement about who she believed she was and what she wanted me to understand. The air in the room thickened. I felt my jaw tighten, but instead of arguing or dismissing her, I looked straight at her and asked, "You're independent? All right then, prove it." She blinked, surprised at my calm response, maybe expecting me to fight back or reassure her. Instead, I gave her a challenge. Those 3 words, "prove it," hung between us like a dare neither of us had anticipated. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted. It was no longer about whether she was independent or not. It was about whether she could live up to her own declaration, and whether I was willing to let her try. The truth is, Claire had always valued her sense of autonomy. When we first met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner years ago, she was the kind of woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. She spoke about her dreams, her ambitions, her refusal to be boxed into anyone else's expectations. That was part of what attracted me to her in the first place, her fire, her drive, her unwillingness to settle. But as the years passed, marriage had a way of blending our lives in ways neither of us fully anticipated. Bills, schedules, responsibilities, they all required compromise. And in that compromise, perhaps she felt like she was losing pieces of the freedom she once held so tightly. As I looked at her across the table that night, I realized this was more than just a casual remark. It was a revelation of what had been brewing under the surface. And though a part of me wanted to argue, to tell her she was overthinking, another part of me, the deeper, quieter part, decided that maybe it was time to see if she truly meant what she said. Maybe it was time to let her walk the path she claimed to be ready for, even if it led us both somewhere unexpected. So I leaned back in my chair, met her eyes, and said again, "Prove it." She tilted her head, almost smirking, as if she didn't believe I was serious. But I was. And from that night on, the stage was set for a journey neither of us saw coming. It wasn't just a test for her. It would end up being a test for both of us. One that would challenge not only her independence but also my own definition of what it meant to be a husband, a partner, and a man. And it all began with those 4 words she spoke so fearlessly. "I'm independent." When I think back to the foundation of our marriage, I realize how much of Claire's declaration made sense when seen through the lens of who she was before we ever said our vows. Claire was always a woman of contrasts, fiercely independent in spirit, but also someone who longed for deep connection. She grew up as the eldest daughter in a family of 4, with parents who leaned heavily on her to help raise her younger siblings while juggling their own financial struggles. From a young age, she learned how to manage tasks, make decisions, and navigate challenges without waiting for someone else to guide her. That early training became the soil where her independence grew, and by the time I met her, she was already carrying herself as someone who knew how to survive in almost any situation. She had graduated top of her class in design school and quickly carved out a place for herself in a competitive field. She freelanced for big brands, often juggling multiple clients, deadlines, and projects all on her own. She loved to brag, half playfully, half seriously, that she didn't need anyone to hold her hand. That was part of the allure when I first met her. At that time, I was still building my career in construction management, and though I had ambition, I wasn't nearly as established. I admired her drive, her confidence, and the way she made things happen for herself. When she walked into a room, people noticed, not just because of her looks, but because she carried a kind of energy that said she belonged anywhere she went. Our relationship began like so many do, with sparks and late-night conversations that made us feel invincible. She told me early on that one of the things she feared most was being trapped, whether in a job, a relationship, or a life that didn't reflect her values. I thought I understood what she meant, and back then, I believed I could give her both the partnership and the freedom she craved. We married after 3 years of dating, and in the beginning, life seemed to live up to the promises we made each other. We rented a small apartment in the city, decorated with her sketches and my modest collection of vintage records. We had energy, ambition, and a shared vision that our life together would be a mix of stability and adventure. We promised to never let routine dull our spark. But as time passed, reality set in. Careers demanded more time, responsibilities stacked up, and the little joys we once took for granted became harder to hold on to. We bought our first house because it made sense financially, but the move also anchored us in a way that neither of us anticipated. I fell into the role of provider more deeply than I realized, often working long hours to make sure the mortgage, bills, and savings goals were met. Claire, on the other hand, continued to work, but she chose the kind of projects that allowed her flexibility rather than stability. She enjoyed her freedom, her ability to work from home or take a trip on short notice, but that also meant her income fluctuated and wasn't always reliable. Over time, the balance between us shifted quietly. I never complained, but I often carried the heavier share of financial responsibility, and without either of us saying it aloud, I became the safety net. To me, that was part of marriage, stepping up where one person was stronger or more available. But to Claire, perhaps, it felt like dependence creeping in through the cracks of our carefully crafted partnership. She never liked the idea of leaning too heavily on anyone, even me. And I suspect that realization gnawed at her over the years until it finally burst out in the form of her declaration that night. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Outside of finances, we had built what most people would call a comfortable life. Weekends often involved hosting friends, going on hikes, or trying out new restaurants in town. Claire loved to entertain, often setting up elaborate dinner parties where she showed off her cooking and decorating skills. Our home became a gathering place, not extravagant but warm and welcoming. People often complimented us on how well we seemed to complement each other, her creativity balanced by my practicality, her boldness softened by my steadiness. On the surface, it looked like we had it figured out. But what people didn't see were the subtle moments when Claire's independent streak clashed with the quiet structure I had built to keep our lives stable. For example, she often booked spontaneous trips with friends, only telling me after the fact. Or she'd make purchases for the house, furniture, gadgets, or art pieces, without discussing them with me first, even though we shared finances. At first, I brushed these things off as quirks, reminders of her free-spirited nature. But over time, those small choices highlighted a bigger tension. She wanted complete freedom, Yet she also wanted the safety net that came with our marriage. And I suppose I enabled that balance, without realizing how much it was feeding into her deeper need to assert herself. That night at the dining table, when she told me she was independent, I couldn't help but remember the woman I met years ago, the one who told me she would never let anyone box her in. The problem was, life itself tends to box people in. Responsibilities, commitments, and sacrifices are part of adulthood, and marriage doubles that reality. The version of her that wanted to stay untethered was in constant conflict with the version of her that had built a home and a marriage with me. From my side, I wasn't entirely blameless. I had gotten used to being the steady one, the provider, the one who kept the ground from shaking beneath our feet. Perhaps I leaned too far into that role, unintentionally making her feel like she was being, quote, taken care of, in ways that undermined her sense of autonomy. It wasn't that I wanted her dependent on me. I actually admired her independence. But I also knew what it took to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table, and sometimes my pragmatism clashed with her ideals. Looking back, I see how the stage was perfectly set for that pivotal moment. The woman who had always prided herself on being self-sufficient was beginning to feel the walls of marriage pressing in on her freedom. The man who thought he was supporting his wife by carrying more than his share of the load was, unknowingly, reinforcing the very dependence she wanted to escape. It was inevitable that something had to give. That's why when she made her declaration, it wasn't just about that single moment. It was the culmination of years of tension, values, and unspoken fears. And as much as it stung to hear, I knew deep down that it was time to let her prove what she claimed, even if the process was messy, uncomfortable, and more revealing than either of us expected. When I think about how it all started, I realize that the seeds of our conflict were planted long before marriage, long before Claire even declared her independence at the dining table. Back in those early days, everything about our relationship seemed wrapped in possibility. I was drawn to Claire because she had an energy that made the world feel bigger than it was. She carried herself like she could conquer anything, and I wanted to be the man who stood beside her while she did it. When we first began dating, there was no talk of constraints or responsibilities. We were two young people in love, intoxicated by late-night drives with the windows rolled down, long conversations that stretched until sunrise, and weekends spent discovering new corners of the city. Those early moments carried an intensity that made me believe nothing could shake us. I remember our first trip together, just 6 months into dating. Claire had this idea to visit a coastal town 3 hours away on a whim. I was hesitant at first because I had work deadlines, but she insisted. "We'll make memories, Adrian. Work will always be there. Life won't wait," she said, and I caved. That trip turned out to be magical. We stayed at a small bed and breakfast by the sea, explored little shops along the pier, and walked barefoot on the sand under a sky filled with stars. I fell harder for her in those days, watching her move freely, unhindered by the weight of schedules or obligations. She had a way of pulling me out of my head, reminding me that life wasn't meant to be lived entirely by rules and calendars. Back then, her independence wasn't something that felt threatening. It was exhilarating. She was the storm I didn't know I needed, and I felt lucky to be carried by its winds. The beginning of our relationship was full of moments like that, impulsive decisions, laughter that came easily, and a sense that we were building something extraordinary together. Claire's friends often told her how different she seemed when she was with me. They said she looked more at ease, more open, as if being with me allowed her to soften without losing her edge. She, in turn, told me that I grounded her, that my practicality was a stabilizing force in her whirlwind life. For a while, it felt like the perfect balance. She brought the spark. I brought the anchor. Together, we created a rhythm that worked. But even in those early days, if I look closely, I can see the faint outlines of what would later become cracks. I recall small conversations where Claire would say things like, "I'll never give up my freedom, Adrian. I love you, but I'll always be my own person first." At the time, I admired it. I thought it was just part of her charm, her boldness. I never imagined those words would echo so loudly years later in our marriage. I also remember moments when she resisted leaning on me, even for small things. If her car broke down, she'd rather figure it out herself than call me for help. If she was sick, she pushed through without wanting me to fuss over her. She insisted on splitting bills during the early part of our relationship, even when I offered to cover more. To me, it was unusual, but it also made me respect her more. She wasn't with me because she needed me. She was with me because she chose me. And in those days, that distinction mattered. The real beginning of our shared life, though, started when we decided to move in together. I still remember helping her pack up her tiny studio apartment, where she had every inch decorated with sketches pinned to the walls, books stacked on the floor, and plants crowded around the single window that faced the alley. It was a space that screamed independence, messy, alive, hers. When she moved into my place, it was the first time we had to learn what it meant to merge two worlds into one. She brought her chaotic creativity, and I brought my structure. We argued over closet space, laughed about our different sleeping schedules, and compromised on how to split chores. But even then, she was insistent that she pull her own weight, that she contribute equally, that she never slip into being taken care of. When I proposed to her a year later, I remember her reaction vividly. She said yes without hesitation, but later that night she confessed she had been scared. Not scared of me, not scared of our love, but scared of losing herself. "Marriage changes things," she whispered, lying next to me in the dark. "I don't want to become someone who disappears into being a wife." I kissed her forehead and told her she'd never lose who she was, that I loved her exactly as she was, and that nothing about marriage would take that away. I believed it when I said it. She wanted reassurance that independence and commitment could coexist, and I promised her they could. In those early chapters, we were both living on dreams and conviction. We believed that love was strong enough to make everything work. I believed that her independence would always be a beautiful part of our dynamic, not something that would one day wedge itself between us. She believed that I could be her partner without ever dimming her light. We stood on the edge of a life that looked full of promise, blind to the ways that life would test those beliefs. Looking back now, I can see that the beginning wasn't just about romance and spark. It was also about laying the groundwork for the very conflict that would later shake us. Claire's independence was never something new. It was there from the start, baked into her identity, and my role as the steady anchor was always present too. We just didn't realize that, over time, those roles could clash as much as they complemented. At the beginning, though, it all felt perfect. And maybe that's why it hurt so much when perfection started to crumble. The good times in our marriage were the kind of memories that made everything else worth enduring, the golden glow that often tricked us into thinking our foundation was unshakable. These were the years when Claire and I lived in rhythm, when our strengths didn't clash but rather wove together into a life that felt rich and full. If you had looked at us then, you'd have thought we were the picture of stability and happiness, and in many ways we were. We found joy in the little things that became traditions. Our Friday night dinners where we tried a new recipe together. Our Sunday morning coffee rituals where we lingered over mugs long after the caffeine had cooled. And our summer evenings spent in the backyard with the grill fired up and music playing softly in the background. These weren't extravagant moments, but they were ours, and they stitched us closer with every repetition. Claire thrived in those days. She was in demand as a designer, landing contracts with bigger clients than ever before, and I was proud to watch her work light up her eyes. There was something magnetic about the way she'd lean over her laptop late at night, glasses perched on her nose, completely absorbed in her craft. I'd often bring her a cup of tea and sit across the table, quietly admiring her focus. She didn't need me to understand every detail of her projects. She just wanted me nearby, and I gave her that without question. In turn, she celebrated my wins at work, throwing her arms around me whenever I came home with a promotion or a story about a successful project. We became each other's biggest cheerleaders, and for a while it seemed like our balance was perfect. One of my favorite memories from those years was the time we saved up for a 2-week trip to Italy. It was the first major vacation we planned as husband and wife, and it felt like a reward for all the hard work we had poured into our careers. We wandered through cobblestone streets in Florence, ate our weight in pasta in Rome, and stood in awe before the canals of Venice. Claire was in her element, soaking up every detail, sketching little corners of the city in her notebook while I took photos of her laughing with gelato in hand. For those 2 weeks, nothing else existed. No deadlines, no bills, no responsibilities. Just us, the way it used to be in the beginning, but deeper now, layered with the comfort of years spent together. On the flight home, she leaned her head against my shoulder and whispered, I could live like this forever. And in that moment, I believed her. Back at home, the glow of that trip lingered, and we found ways to bring it into our everyday lives. We tried to recreate the recipes we had learned from a cooking class in Tuscany, and we hung a framed photo of us in front of the Colosseum in the hallway as a reminder of what we were capable of experiencing together. Those were the days when I thought we had cracked the code to happiness. Not because everything was perfect, but because we seemed to carry the same vision of what our life could be. Financially, we were doing better too. My career was stable, and though Claire's income was inconsistent, the combination gave us enough breathing room to enjoy life without constant worry. We hosted dinner parties, splurged occasionally on nice things for the house, and even started talking seriously about the possibility of children. Claire wasn't ready yet, and I respected that, but just the fact that we were discussing it felt like a sign of our progress. For me, those conversations hinted at a future where her independence could coexist with the family we dreamed of, and it gave me hope that we were moving in the right direction. Our friends often envied us, though they never said it outright. They'd watch the way Claire laughed at my corny jokes or the way I instinctively reached for her hand in crowded places, and they'd comment on how lucky we were to have found each other. And I believed it. I believed we were lucky, that all the struggles of balancing two strong personalities had led us to a sweet spot where we could simply enjoy life together. Looking back now, I realize those good times were also the camouflage that hid the fractures forming beneath the surface. When things were going well, we didn't question the dynamics between us. Claire's need for freedom didn't feel threatening when everything else was light and easy. If she booked a spontaneous weekend getaway with her friends, I brushed it off because we had so much good between us. If she bought something expensive without telling me, I didn't let it bother me because we were still laughing together at the end of the night. Love has a way of blinding you like that, making you believe that joy today guarantees stability tomorrow. But in those moments, none of that mattered. All I knew was that we had built a life full of moments worth remembering. A life that felt enviable from the outside and fulfilling from the inside. Claire would look at me across the dinner table, eyes shining, and tell me she felt lucky to have me. I'd squeeze her hand and think the same. We had weathered the uncertainties of young love and come out stronger, or so I thought. Those good times were the reason I kept holding on later, even when everything began to fall apart. They were the proof that what we had was real, worth fighting for, and that's what made the eventual unraveling so painful. Because when you've lived through moments that feel like paradise, the cracks in the walls of your marriage don't just feel like problems, they feel like betrayals of everything you thought you had. At the peak of our good times, I never imagined that a single sentence, "I'm independent," could shift the ground beneath us so completely. But that's the thing about golden years. They make you forget that shadows are always waiting to return. The first warning signs came quietly, almost too subtle to notice at first, like hairline cracks in glass that only become obvious when the pressure builds. For a while after our golden period, life continued to look smooth from the outside. But underneath, Claire's need to assert her independence began to surface more forcefully. It wasn't in explosive arguments or dramatic declarations, at least not at the start. It was in the little shifts of behavior, the small choices she made that told me she was trying to reclaim something she felt she was losing. And at the time, I wasn't sure if I should confront those moments or let them pass, but either way, they began to accumulate, piece by piece, until they became impossible to ignore. The first real shift came when Claire started pulling back from our shared routines. Our Friday night dinners, once sacred, became optional in her eyes. She'd casually mention she had plans with friends, or that she was too busy with a project to cook together. At first, I told myself it was fine. We all needed space, after all, but the frequency of her absences grew. What had been a consistent time for us to reconnect started to feel like a coin toss. Would she be there, or would she be off doing her own thing? I'd sit at the dinner table alone some nights, reheating leftovers, telling myself it was just a phase. But deep down, I felt the sting of her priorities shifting. Another warning sign came in the form of money. Claire had always been proud of the fact that she contributed financially, even if her income was inconsistent. But now she began making bigger purchases without consulting me. One afternoon, I came home to find a brand new leather sofa in the living room. It was beautiful, sleek, and no doubt expensive. When I asked her about it, she brushed me off with a laugh. "I got a good deal, Adrian. Don't worry about it. I wanted to surprise you." But the truth was, it wasn't about surprising me. It was about making decisions on her own, staking her claim on the life we shared. I wanted to argue, to tell her that big purchases needed to be discussed, but something in her tone made me hold back. I told myself again that it wasn't worth a fight, but the unease lingered. Then there was her time. Claire had always been social, but now she seemed to be spending more evenings out with friends than at home with me. She joined a book club, signed up for a yoga class, and started going on weekend trips with her girlfriends. None of those things were bad on their own, but the pattern was clear. She was carving out a life that existed parallel to ours, one where my presence was optional. I'd watch her get ready for yet another outing, slipping into a dress and smiling at her reflection, and I'd wonder when I had stopped being the person she wanted to share her evenings with. The subtle digs began around this time, too. In conversations with friends, she'd joke about being the real boss of the house, or she'd make comments like, "I don't need Adrian to take care of me. I do just fine on my own." Everyone would laugh, including her, but I noticed the way she looked at me afterward, daring me to challenge her words. I never did. I told myself it was harmless humor, but every jab chipped away at me, even if I didn't admit it then. The hardest warning sign to swallow, though, was the emotional distance that began to creep in. Claire was always affectionate, quick to wrap her arms around me or kiss me unexpectedly, but those gestures became less frequent. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt stilted, reduced to logistics about bills, schedules, or errands. When I asked her about her day, she gave short answers, as though the details weren't mine to know anymore. It was like she was building a wall brick by brick, and I could only watch as it grew taller between us. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was stressed with work. Maybe she was just in a phase where she needed more space. Maybe I was imagining things. But my gut told me otherwise. I knew Claire well enough to sense when something deeper was at play, and the pattern was too clear to ignore. She wasn't just pulling away. She was reasserting her independence in ways that left less and less room for me. One night, the tension surfaced more openly. I had asked her if she wanted to go away for the weekend, just the two of us. I thought it would be a chance to reconnect, to bring back some of the magic we used to have. She didn't even look up from her laptop when she replied, "I can't. I already made plans with Mia and the girls." I felt my chest tighten. "You didn't think to ask me first," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She finally looked at me, her expression cool. "Adrian, I don't need to check in with you for everything I do. I'm independent. You know that." There it was again, the word that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Independent. To her, it was a declaration of self. To me, it was starting to sound like a rejection. That moment crystallized what I had been sensing for months. The warning signs weren't random or accidental. They were deliberate choices, conscious or not, to reinforce her identity as someone who didn't need me. And as much as I wanted to deny it, a part of me feared she was right. Maybe she didn't need me the way I thought she did. Maybe I was just the steady presence she tolerated, while she longed for something else entirely. Looking back, I can see how those warning signs were the beginning of a shift neither of us could reverse. They weren't loud or dramatic, but they carried a weight that grew heavier with each passing week. And though I kept telling myself we'd find our way back, a part of me already knew. Something fundamental had changed, and it wasn't going away. The warning signs had already unsettled me, but what came next was far more difficult to ignore, because the small cracks in our marriage widened into fractures that demanded my attention. It was no longer subtle shifts in her schedule or sly comments in public. It became the way she carried herself, the decisions she made without hesitation, and the bluntness with which she spoke to me when I tried to question her. At first, I thought I could absorb it, adapt to her growing independence the way I always had. But the truth was that the balance of our marriage had shifted, and I found myself standing on unstable ground, unsure of how long I could hold steady. The escalation began when Claire decided she wanted her own bank account, separate from the one we had always shared. We had operated as a team financially since the day we got married, pooling our resources, discussing big expenses, and planning for the future together. But one morning, over coffee, she casually announced, "I'm opening a new account. I need something that's just mine." I nearly choked on my drink. "What do you mean, just yours?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. She shrugged, stirring sugar into her cup. I don't want to feel like I have to explain every transaction or check with you before buying something. It's about freedom." She said it so plainly, as if it was the most natural decision in the world. I nodded slowly, but inside I felt the sting. It wasn't about the money. It was about the symbolism. She was carving out a financial space where I didn't belong, a piece of her life cordoned off from mine. Not long after that, she began spending nights away from home more frequently. At first, it was because of her book club or yoga class, but soon the explanations grew vaguer. "I'm staying over at Mia's," she'd say, grabbing her overnight bag. Or, "Don't wait up, I'll be back tomorrow." I would ask who she was with, what she was doing, not because I wanted to control her, but because I needed reassurance. Yet each time, she gave me less detail, as though my questions themselves were an intrusion. One night when I pressed a little harder, she snapped. "Adrian, I don't need to give you a play-by-play of my life. Stop acting like you own me." Her words cut deep, and I didn't argue further. I told myself trust was the foundation of marriage, and if I kept doubting her, I'd be the one tearing it down. But a seed of unease had already been planted, and it grew every time she walked out the door without looking back. The way she spoke to me at home also shifted, from subtle jabs to outright dismissiveness. If I offered an opinion about something, she'd roll her eyes and say, "You wouldn't understand." If I suggested spending more time together, she'd reply, "I'm not a teenager who needs to be glued to you every weekend." Even in front of friends, she became sharper. At a dinner party, someone asked if she enjoyed being married, and she laughed. "I do, but only because I keep my independence. If I had to rely on Adrian for everything, I'd lose my mind." Everyone chuckled politely, but I sat there, heat rising to my face, realizing that she wasn't joking anymore. These weren't harmless comments. They were her truth, spoken loudly enough for the world to hear. The most painful escalation came in the intimacy we shared. Claire was always the one who brought warmth into our relationship, the one who reached for my hand or pulled me close when we watched television. But that warmth cooled, replaced by a distance I couldn't seem to bridge. When I tried to hold her, she stiffened. When I kissed her, she turned her head slightly, offering me her cheek instead of her lips. And when I finally asked what was wrong, she sighed. "Adrian, I just need space. I can't breathe when you're always looking for reassurance. I need to feel like my own person, not part of some unit that defines me." I nodded, but my heart sank. How was I supposed to respect her independence without losing the closeness that made our marriage feel alive? Her professional ambitions added another layer to the problem. Claire had been talking about starting her own business for years, but now she threw herself into it with relentless focus. She attended workshops, networked at events, and spent late nights drafting business plans. I was proud of her drive, but it quickly became clear that her dream was consuming her attention in a way that left little room for me. When I tried to celebrate her progress, she dismissed my support. "This is my thing, Adrian. I don't need you to validate it." It wasn't that she didn't want encouragement. It was that she wanted it to come from herself, not from me. I felt increasingly like a bystander in her life, watching from the sidelines as she built something that excluded me entirely. The arguments became more frequent, and each one left us a little more fractured. One night, after she came home late without explanation, I finally confronted her. "Do you even want to be married anymore?" I asked, my voice heavy with frustration. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, and after a long pause, she said, "I want to be married, but not if it means sacrificing who I am. If you can't handle me being independent, then maybe you're the problem." Her words struck me like a hammer, and I realized in that moment that she didn't see her behavior as destructive. She saw it as liberation. And any resistance on my part only confirmed her belief that I was holding her back. Looking back, I understand now that these escalating problems weren't sudden explosions. They were the natural progression of the seeds she had been planting for years. Claire wasn't just asserting her independence, she was redefining what our marriage meant on her terms. And I, caught between wanting to respect her and needing to preserve what we had, found myself trapped in a dilemma with no easy answer. The more I tried to hold on, the more she pulled away, until it felt like we were standing on opposite shores, waving at each other across a widening sea. When the problems at home began to mount, I found myself wrestling with questions I couldn't answer on my own. Was I being too controlling? Was I suffocating Claire with my expectations? Or was she pushing the boundaries of marriage beyond what was reasonable? I felt caught in a fog of confusion, uncertain whether the doubts gnawing at me were signs of my insecurity or proof that something was truly wrong. It was in this vulnerable state that I turned to the people around me, hoping for clarity, for some outside perspective that could either confirm my fears or calm them. And it was through those conversations that I began to see my situation more clearly, not from my own biased lens but through the eyes of those who loved me. The first person I confided in was my younger sister, Elena. She had always been the kind of sibling who listened without judgment, the one I could call late at night and trust with my worries. One evening, after another tense exchange with Claire, I dialed her number and let the words spill out. I told her about the new bank account, the late nights, the way Claire dismissed me in front of friends. Elena listened quietly, her silence broken only by the occasional hum of acknowledgement. When I finished, she exhaled sharply. "Adrian, that doesn't sound like independence. That sounds like detachment. There's a difference. Independence is being strong within a relationship. Detachment is pulling away from it." Her words struck me. Simple but profound. For the first time, I realized that maybe Claire wasn't trying to strengthen herself within our marriage. Maybe she was creating distance from it altogether. Later, I opened up to my best friend Marcus, someone I had known since college. We met for lunch at a small diner, the kind of place we used to frequent back when life felt simpler. As I explained what had been happening, Marcus leaned back in his seat, his brows furrowed. "Man, I've seen Claire with you for years. She used to light up when you walked in the room. Now you're telling me she avoids you, shuts you down, and spends nights away without telling you where she is? That's not independence, that's disrespect." His bluntness was jarring, but it echoed the unease I already felt. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You've always been the one who gives and compromises, Adrian, but tell me, when's the last time she compromised for you?" I couldn't answer. The question hung in the air like a verdict I had been avoiding. Even my parents, who rarely involved themselves in my marriage, noticed something was off. One Sunday, during a family dinner, my mother pulled me aside. She had seen the way Claire barely engaged in conversation, glued to her phone, answering questions with clipped replies. "Adrian?" she whispered, concern etched into her face. "She doesn't look happy, and neither do you. Marriage is about partnership, not two separate lives under one roof. Don't let her convince you otherwise." I tried to defend Claire, saying she was just focused on her work, that she valued her independence. But even as I spoke, the excuses felt hollow, and my mother's knowing gaze told me she saw right through them. Perhaps the most sobering validation came from an unexpected source. Claire's own friend Naomi. We had known her for years, and she often joined us for group gatherings. One afternoon, while Claire was in the kitchen, Naomi pulled me aside. Her tone was careful, almost hesitant. "Adrian, I'm not trying to interfere, but I think you should know something. Claire talks about independence a lot, but sometimes it sounds like she's talking about life without you in it. I don't think she realizes how much that hurts, but it's clear she's been testing her boundaries." My stomach dropped. Hearing that from someone in Claire's circle felt like confirmation I couldn't dismiss. If her own friend could see the cracks, then they weren't just in my head. They were real, visible, undeniable. The accumulation of these voices began to weigh on me, not in a burdensome way, but in a clarifying one. Each conversation added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a picture I had been too close to see. I had wanted to believe that Claire's pursuit of independence was healthy, that it was simply part of her growth as a person. But the people I trusted most all seemed to agree. Independence should not come at the cost of connection, and what Claire was doing was less about balance and more about escape. On E was sûr. Still, there was a part of me that clung to hope. I remembered the woman I had fallen in love with, the one who once spoke about dreams of building a future together, not apart. I wanted to believe that this phase was temporary, that with enough patience we could find our way back. But each outside perspective reminded me that patience had limits, and that my willingness to overlook her behavior might be enabling it. Elena's words echoed in my mind. There's a difference between independence and detachment. As the days passed, I began to notice more clearly the small moments that proved her distance. When I cooked dinner, she ate quickly and retreated to her office. When I tried to share stories about my day, she nodded distractedly, eyes fixed on her laptop screen. When I suggested a weekend trip, she declined, saying she had other plans. And each time, I thought about Marcus's question, when had she last compromised for me? The silence of that unanswered question grew louder, until it was impossible to ignore. External validation didn't just confirm my fears. It gave me permission to acknowledge them. It stripped away the denial I had been clinging to, the false reassurance that things would naturally improve. It showed me that others could see what I had tried to hide, and that if I wanted to preserve any sense of dignity, I needed to stop pretending everything was fine. The voices of my sister, my friend, my mother, even Claire's own friend, all converged into one undeniable truth. This wasn't about independence anymore. It was about a marriage unraveling, thread by thread, while I stood by, hoping it would mend itself. And with that realization, the weight on my chest grew heavier, but so did my resolve. For the first time, I stopped asking if I was overreacting and started asking what I was going to do about it. Because if everyone else could see the cracks, then it was only a matter of time before the whole foundation collapsed. There comes a point when denial is no longer possible, when the excuses you've whispered to yourself for months collapse under the weight of truth, and all that's left is the raw, unfiltered reality of what your life has become. For me, that moment arrived on a gray Saturday morning that should have been ordinary, but instead carved itself into my memory as the day I finally saw my marriage for what it truly was. It was the moment I hit rock bottom, when Claire's pursuit of independence no longer felt like a declaration of strength, but rather a clear rejection of the bond we had built together. I woke up that morning to an empty bed. At first, I thought Claire had gone downstairs for coffee, but as I walked through the house, I realized she wasn't there. Her car was gone too. On the kitchen counter sat a note written in her neat handwriting. "Don't wait for me. I'll be gone for the weekend. Need time for myself." That was it. No explanation, no destination, no mention of when exactly she'd return. Just a statement, as if she owed me nothing, as if her decision to disappear for days was a perfectly acceptable expression of her independence. I stood there staring at the note, my hands trembling, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a stone. At first, anger flared. How could she think this was okay? How could she treat our marriage like a casual arrangement where she could vanish at will, leaving me behind to wonder, to worry? But beneath the anger was something far worse, an aching emptiness that told me this wasn't just about a weekend away. This was about a deeper truth I had refused to face. Claire was already living as though she wasn't married, and I had been the one pretending otherwise. The hours dragged on painfully that day. I tried to distract myself with chores, with television, with anything that could dull the hollow feeling in my chest. But every corner of the house reminded me of her absence. The coffee mugs we always used on weekends sat untouched. The couch where we used to curl up together felt unbearably large. Even the silence of the room seemed louder without her presence. I realized then that I had been living in a half-marriage, clinging to the remnants of a bond that existed more in memory than in reality. That evening, Marcus called to check in. I told him about the note, about her leaving without warning. He was silent for a long moment before he said, "Adrian, she's already gone. Maybe not physically, not yet, but emotionally? She checked out a long time ago." His words pierced me, because deep down, I knew he was right. I wanted to argue, to say she just needed space, but I couldn't. The evidence was stacked too high, and denial no longer held. The next day was worse. I woke again to silence, to the absence of her voice, her laughter, even her criticisms. And in that silence, my mind spiraled. Where was she? Who was she with? What was she doing? The possibilities gnawed at me, each one more painful than the last. I felt powerless, like a bystander in my own marriage, watching as my partner built a life that no longer included me. By the time Sunday night came and she still hadn't returned, the weight of abandonment crushed me completely. I sat on the edge of our bed, staring at the door, realizing I had reached the breaking point. When Claire finally walked in late that night, she looked refreshed, almost glowing, as if her weekend away had been a retreat that filled her with energy. She dropped her bag by the door and gave me a half smile. "Don't look at me like that, Adrian. I told you I needed space." I stared at her, my chest tight, and asked, "Do you even care how this makes me feel? Do you even care that you're hurting me?" She sighed, brushing past me as though I were being dramatic. "I care, but I'm not going to live my life in chains just to make you feel secure. If you can't handle me being independent, that's not my problem." Her words landed like a final blow, stripping away any illusion I had left. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was an obstacle, a tether she wanted to sever. The woman who once vowed to share her life with me now saw me as a constraint on her freedom. And no matter how much I loved her, no matter how much I wanted to hold on, I couldn't keep pretending that this was still a marriage built on mutual respect and commitment. That night, as I lay awake beside her while she slept peacefully, I reached my final realization. Independence was never the enemy. I had always admired her strength, her drive. But what Claire wanted wasn't independence within our marriage. What she wanted was independence from our marriage. She didn't want to coexist as equals, each with our own identity. She wanted to carve out a life that excluded me entirely. And I, in my desperation to preserve what we had been complicit in my own erasure. The clarity was brutal but liberating. I finally saw the truth that had been staring me in the face for months. I couldn't save this marriage alone. I couldn't love her enough to fill the void she had chosen to create. And for the first time, instead of clinging to the hope that she would come back to me, I accepted that she already had one foot out the door. Hitting rock bottom isn't about losing everything in one sudden crash. It's about realizing you've already been living in the ruins, pretending they were still a home. And as I lay there in the dark, listening to her steady breathing, I knew that the next step was no longer about saving us. It was about saving myself. The morning after my final realization, I woke with an unfamiliar calmness in my chest. It wasn't peace exactly, but it wasn't the suffocating weight of doubt and fear I had grown used to either. It was resolve. For months I had been trying to convince myself that things would change, that Claire would eventually return to the woman I had married. But now I understood. She wasn't coming back. She didn't want to. And if I continued to wait for her, I would only be prolonging my own misery. So I decided that day that I was done waiting. I would no longer beg for scraps of her attention or bend myself to fit the shifting shape of her independence. It was time to reclaim my dignity and make the choice she had been avoiding. I started with something simple but symbolic. I gathered her note from the kitchen counter, the one where she told me she'd be gone for the weekend, and I folded it carefully before dropping it into the trash. That note had haunted me, its words echoing in my mind like a reminder of how far she had drifted away. Disposing of it felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Afterward, I sat at the dining table with a notepad and began writing down everything I needed to do. Cancel the joint accounts, separate bills, consult a lawyer, decide where I would live. Each bullet point was like a step toward freedom, and with each one, I felt the fog lift a little more. When Claire came downstairs later that morning, she was scrolling on her phone, barely acknowledging me as she poured herself coffee. For once, I didn't try to engage her, didn't ask about her plans or try to bridge the gap. Instead, I said calmly, "Claire, I think it's time we talk about separation." Her head snapped up, eyes narrowing, clearly not expecting me to be the one to say it. "What do you mean?" she asked, her tone defensive, almost accusatory. I met her gaze steadily. "I mean, I'm done pretending this marriage is working. You've made it clear you want independence, and I'm not going to stand in your way anymore. But I also won't stay in a marriage where I'm treated like an afterthought." She blinked, clearly caught off guard. For months, she had held all the power, deciding when she wanted space, when she wanted connection, when she wanted to disappear. Now, I was flipping the script, and she didn't know how to react. "So that's it? You're just giving up?" she said, her voice rising. I shook my head. "No, Claire. I gave everything I could. You're the one who walked away a long time ago. I'm just finally accepting it." For the first time in a long while, I saw something flash across her face. Maybe regret, maybe fear. But I didn't let it sway me. I had already made my decision. The next few weeks were grueling but necessary. I met with a lawyer to begin the process of divorce, and though it felt strange to sit in an office discussing the dismantling of a life I once thought permanent, it also felt strangely empowering. I started moving my belongings into a small apartment across town, one that wasn't as spacious or polished as the house we had shared, but it was mine. Each box I carried up the stairs felt like a step away from the chaos and into a new beginning. Claire's reactions during this time were a mix of indifference and outbursts. Some days she acted as though she didn't care, scrolling through her phone while I packed. Other days she lashed out, accusing me of being weak, of abandoning her, of not fighting harder for our marriage. But I no longer absorbed her words like arrows. I let them fall flat, because deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't abandonment. This was liberation for both of us. She had wanted independence, and now she had it, though perhaps not in the way she had envisioned. What surprised me most during this period was the relief that followed each step forward. For so long, I had been terrified of losing Claire, of what my life would look like without her. But once the process began, I realized that what I had been clinging to wasn't love anymore. It was fear. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of admitting that something I had invested so much in was broken beyond repair. And once I let go of that fear, I began to feel lighter. I began to see possibilities again, ones I had buried under the weight of a failing marriage. The turning point came one quiet evening in my new apartment. I was unpacking boxes, arranging dishes in the cabinets, when I suddenly felt a wave of peace wash over me. For the first time in years, the space around me was calm, without tension or criticism or silence that cut like glass. It was just me, in my own place, free to breathe, free to exist without feeling like I was constantly walking on eggshells. I sat down on the couch, took a deep breath, and realized this was what independence felt like. Not the kind that Claire had wielded as a weapon, but the kind that comes from reclaiming your own life. A cone. Over the months that followed, I focused on rebuilding. I reconnected with friends I had neglected, spent weekends with my family, and even picked up hobbies I had long abandoned. I found joy in simple things, cooking meals for myself, going for evening runs, sitting in silence without feeling lonely. Slowly, I began to rediscover who I was outside of the marriage, and that rediscovery became the most rewarding part of all. Looking back now, I don't regret telling Claire to prove her independence, because in a way, she did. She proved that she didn't need me, and in turn she forced me to prove that I didn't need her either. What began as her challenge became mine, and through it, I learned that independence within a marriage is valuable, but independence from a toxic dynamic is essential. If there's anything I've taken away from this journey, it's that love without respect cannot survive, and commitment without compromise is nothing more than captivity. Sometimes the bravest choice is not to hold on, but to let go. To trust that in the ruins of what you've lost, you'll find the foundation for something better. And in my case, letting go of Claire wasn't just the end of my marriage, it was the beginning of my freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.